That's not as long as it usually is.
Right, so we can call the order at 12:01. Looks like we have some members that if we have citizen comments. Be here to.
If I do one comment, I'm glad to see young people that were interested in disability. One thing I can say, there might be a slight disadvantage, because they may not appreciate what us older people have to do or put up with physically and mentally. So that's something maybe you might want to try to educate yourselves on.
Well, there's a great reason to stick around, Mike.
Yeah, Mike.
Anybody who Jed was a member of the Disability Advisory Commission for many, many years.
Well,
But speak.
that's how long I was on.
Well, then you're outlasting everybody. That could be a kudos.
I'm not out. Mark and I work on about the same time.
Okay.
If I may. I would like to tell you that we hear you loud and clear, and we agree with you. I'm speaking for multiple people, I believe, but from my perspective, I want to make sure that you understand that I hear you. Appreciate it, Mike.
And that is where we do have an advantage with people from a wide spectrum of agencies and experiences that see it. Community of advanced age will not go under the radar, between the cracks, so to say, Jay.
Okay.
Okay. So discussion items for today will be the accommodation for a sober living home and the city's process for requested accommodations. Isn't limited to sober living necessarily, but what the city process is for addressing requests for such.
Do you want me to kick it off?
Yes, please.
So just to talk a little bit about the city's process for accommodations, of course, we have a policy in our personnel policy that is specific to employees. But when we're talking about citizens within the city of Lewiston requesting an accommodation, under Title II of the ADA, we are local and state governments are required to provide reasonable accommodations to their services, facilities, programs. And so because of that, citizens can make requests to the city for an accommodation if they have a disability and are requesting an accommodation for one of those things. And so this is also kind of an educational thing for our community, that if they are needing an accommodation, they can reach out to myself. I'm the ADA coordinator for the city. And we are working on developing a policy for reasonable accommodations. And maybe that's something future meeting that we can bring back to you guys to discuss further. Specifically when it comes to disabilities, obviously the ADA has a broad description of what that is. When it comes to recovery for drugs and alcohol, that is a protected disability under the ADA. And so specifically, we thought this was a good discussion item for DAC to have on disabilities and accommodations, and when accommodations need to be provided. I don't know if that's clear enough direction. This is also something that Councilor Wright wanted to discuss further. We recently had a request and went through an interactive process with the requester to determine if the city could provide an accommodation. And we did provide the requester with an accommodation. And we've heard some feedback from the community. And so part of that is also, since it's an ADA topic, was a good idea to come here and just discuss it with the DAC team and see what comments or questions or what the discussion would be regarding that. So when it comes to the recovery facility, it would be individuals in a residence who are in recovery. And we applied city code to that request and approved it. There was no notification provided to the neighbors because that's not a requirement of the city. just like we would not notify a neighbor of any other disability. And so I know I see some members of the community, but there was, some response to that approval. And, I don't know if Jennifer or Matt, you guys have any comments to make either on that? Or just open it up for discussion?
Just one comment why I thought it was appropriate to bring it here is, there's always two sides. There's, the group, at least two sides there. So there's the group that was requesting the accommodation. And then there were the neighbors of this property where the accommodation was given. And, how do we balance the concerns on both sides? And it seemed appropriate and bring to this group to discuss that. You seem to have the most experience talking about these situations.
So for those that don't know me, my name is Jennifer Tangano. I'm city attorney for the city of Lewiston. And to kind of expand a little on what Nikki was saying, the city receives reasonable accommodation requests in addition to its programs and everything, but also to its policies, rules, and regulations. And under the ADA and the Fair Housing Act, cities are required to respond to and to review those requests. And if it's something that they can approve without a fundamental alteration to the rule, regulation, or policy, or doesn't constitute an undue financial or administrative burden, then the city is also required to approve it. We can engage in an interactive process with the requester to determine what is a reasonable accommodation, and not necessarily approving the requested accommodation, but finding a possible alternative that would meet the needs of the individual to enjoy, in this case, housing as any other individual would be, and to afford them the same, rights that a non-disabled person would have when it comes to obtaining and enjoying, whatever that program, service, rule, regulation, whatever entails associated with their disability. In this instance, they requested a request for a reasonable accommodation to the city's zoning ordinance related with the definition of family, single family dwelling, and person. And under Idaho code, a single family dwelling is to also include a definition of it is when you have 8 unrelated people who reside together with disabilities. They should be, and they're living together for treatment purposes. They are treated as a single family dwelling.
Up to.
8, up to 8.
Up to.
And then it's also up to 2 live-in givers under the statute. And based on city code, the city does not have a number limit to the term family, but we do have the same limit identified in Idaho code to our definition of single family dwelling, up to 8. I think our city code says mentally or physically disabled. That was modeled on the old rules or the old statute, and we just haven't updated it, but Idaho code governs where it conflicts with city code. So under city code, we reviewed that. And the reason why the state code is that way is because the Idaho legislature has a public policy to favor residential care as much as possible for individuals with disabilities. And they encourage cities and jurisdictions to foster that. Also because it's a state law, we are required to also follow it. And so in working through this regulation and this accommodation request, and the zoning ordinance itself, the goal of zoning is to regulate intensity of uses and types of uses in different zones. And in this particular zone, there's a variety of different types of land uses that are permitted. One of which is a 2-family dwelling. So things like duplexes or, a single property where 2 individual dwelling units are. Now, this particular property is the house itself is fairly substantial. It has about 8 bedrooms and about 5,000 square feet. It was previously remodeled to accommodate all this. I believe it also has 2 kitchens and, there's a lot of stuff about it that, if a family of 16 were to move in, it would likely, be fine. And taking that into consideration, because the city's zoning ordinance related to that particular term and state code, while they're facially discriminatory against disabled people, now there's public policy reasons for it. When we reviewed this particular request through the interactive process, because again, what was requested wasn't what was granted. It was determined that if we classify this as a 2-family dwelling, essentially allowing up to 2 groups of 8 and 2 into the single property, because the property otherwise accommodates it, that would be in keeping with the ADA, the FHA, and the reasonable accommodation request. Because this 2-family dwelling was a permitted use by right, there were no additional notification procedures required by city code or state code associated with this use, but for these individuals were disabled. And so because we would not treat any other people who were potentially moving into a 2-family dwelling or even a single-family dwelling differently, in the sense that if you bought a property and you were gonna move your 16 people into the house, we would not notify the neighbors that 16 people were gonna be moving in. And for that reason, we didn't take any additional steps to notify the neighbors, because the only basis we would be doing it is because they are disabled. And the nature of the disability is what the neighbors are more concerned about. Because it's drug and alcohol disorders or substance use disorders, or other things that might be associated with those type of disabilities. The city treating these people as a protected class would not treat them any differently than if they were any other residents trying to move in, but for following the accommodation process required under the ADA, the FHA, and city and state codes. So that's the process that we followed. There were internal meetings to discuss, are there reasonable accommodations that can be made? What kind of accommodations could be made? If we grant the request as is, how would it affect zoning, land use? How does this affect future decisions and requests for accommodation? Because we do receive a number of requests every year, and some of them we don't approve because they would fundamentally alter our programs, or they require us to create new programs or to create new services that we can't do unless we have funds appropriated. And in many instances, we don't have funds appropriated for these types of requests. And so it would fundamentally alter the nature of the service that we provide, or it would create a financial burden that exceeds our appropriations for the year. So.
Still trying to understand this. This had nothing to do with any modifications to the building. This is purely use.
Yes, it was purely related to the land use classification for these individuals and the use of the property.
Because it's a privately owned building.
Yeah.
Did this go before the Planning and Zoning Commission?
It did not, because any use permitted by right is not required to go before the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Okay.
And the part of the request was to have the reasonable accommodation considered first through city administrative staff, which is typically how those kind of things would play through. It was filed with our planner, but our planner passed it on to our ADA coordinator. And then typically the ADA coordinator, city attorney, the mayor, and the affected department would meet to discuss what the requested, need to say, we've received this accommodation request, this is what is being asked for, what can we do here? And that's pretty much what we did here.
So I understand there was an approval then is what was issued for
Yes,
this use. So if I may, In any duplex in the city of Lewiston, could this happen?
Well, I mean, a duplex would have they would have 8 and 8 in each one.
So no matter where you live in the city, this use could be determined and approved for any duplex anywhere in the city.
It would be approved for any residence. It doesn't
Right.
matter a duplex.
I get the fact that there's a single family home component there, but like with the duplex being multiple families inside of one location, then that is an extension of precedence, then that down the road, that could be a
So the precedents that we were trying to make sure that we set, that was respective of intensity and future land use is, so if I think I understanding what you're saying, if you have a duplex, you already have 2 family units. And if we receive a request to expand that based on, an accommodation, then we would be potentially introducing another family unit there.
essentially, we would be making a statement that in the future, we would be able to have up to 16 disabled applicants and 2 caregivers in any duplex in theory, or triple that in any triplex.
So that's where the way that we classified it would work, but you have to look at the zoning, the underlying zoning. So what we said was each grouping of 8 individuals classified as a single family dwelling unit. So because we had up to 16, that would be 2. If you continue to apply it, if you had 3, that would be 24, but that would be a multi-family dwelling at that point. And a multi-family dwelling is not permitted by right in that zoning area.
Okay, so
And then you would have to go through the conditional use permit, and then you still have to look at whether or not the property, if, but for the disability, could the property and the dwelling accommodate up to 24 people? And that's where, the specifics, these are looked at on a case-by-case basis. So if you had a duplex in your situation and you had a family living in one side and you had a vacancy in the other, and they submitted a similar reasonable accommodation request for up to 16, now we would essentially have 3 dwelling units. So that would take it out of a duplex and put it into a multifamily. And the question is, could the building accommodate it? And does the land use zoning, the zoning, for the property accommodate that type of land use? So by just focusing on the definition of single family dwelling and equating each 8 individuals to a single dwelling unit, we can apply this in future instances, but the underlying zoning scheme still has to fit that use, whether it's permitted or conditional is a secondary classification that is looked at after the request is made. So say a 2-family dwelling was not permitted by right in this particular zone, we still could have granted the accommodation, but they may have had to go through the conditional use process to get the 2-family dwelling aspect approved. That wasn't required here because a 2-family dwelling was permitted by right.
May I ask, I am under the impression that there is an issue within the neighborhood of the use of the property. Because it is a sober living situation. So the discussion then would center around whether or not the neighborhood was to be notified that it was. But,
That could be one component of the discussion,
okay,
is what is the city's obligation in notifying the community that this accommodation was provided? But just like we don't provide notice that your neighbor has a disability or
Right.
your neighbor
I
has a
mean-
disability, there's no,
underlying is HIPAA, I mean, you can't.
you can't. And so it's not a requirement of us to notify the community of a person's disability. Or,
Unless we would otherwise have to, regardless of the disability status of the individuals. If the question, or, if the issue is because these individuals have drug and alcohol abuse disorders, the city needs to notify the neighborhoods. We would not do that if it was an age-related disability. We would not do that if it was a mental disability. We would not do that for any other type of disability
So, sorry.
Oh, do they have to get a disability rating to live in a sober
I'm sorry, say that again.
facility? So they have to go through the process of getting a disability rating to live in a sober.
The proof of a disability.
Because
They
they're
get
gonna
a
ask me,
diagnosis.
what is the? I mean, there's a process
The criteria.
to go through to get a disability, correct?
The
Well,
city,
it can be a known disability. There's some disabilities that are visual, but there are
I know,
some
there's
that
all-
are
they're
known disabilities. So somebody living in a recovery house would be a known, similar reason, live in a facility of a house. So we would know that they're under a disability.
I mean, information was provided to us to indicate that this particular, the company that was applying for the regional accommodation, that they serve primarily disabled individuals, and information was provided to us that would lead us to believe that that is in fact what that was. So, I mean, if the disability is not apparent to us, like sometimes we do get requests, we can ask for documentation, but you know, if we don't have any reason to doubt that the requester is submitting the request, in this instance, on behalf of their clientele, then we are limited in what we can and can't ask for, so.
I guess like, what I'm asking is, to live in a sober living facility, do they have to go through a certain process showing that they have like the, disability, which I guess would be dependency on drugs, and that they're on like a treatment plan?
So the city is not regulating the facility itself. I mean, the facility would have to comply with all of its obligations and individuals that they have. But, unless there is information provided to the city that they are not housing, disabled individuals, then, the mere fact that the facility itself, like the process the facility itself has to screen and accept patients, that's not regulated by the city. So now, you know, like I said, we have received disability requests from individuals where we have requested information because the disability wasn't apparent. You know, and we do that with staff sometimes too, when we get reasonable accommodation requests, if we're not aware or if it's a new disability and whatnot, we can request it, but medical documentation is not an absolute requirement to comply with the ADA and the FHA.
So this is not a public hearing.
No.
Despite if there are people in the audience interested, if they wanted to appeal the city staff's decision, that would go.
There is no appeal right
There
to
is no appeal
this, because the person that has an interest in an accommodation request is the individual applying for the accommodation.
So I was on the city's planning and zoning commission in the late 1980s because I'm ancient. And that predates the Americans with Disability Act. And these kinds of facilities absolutely were regulated and under the land use statute. And they always attracted big audience of people. And not just this subject, I remember a really volatile one over a home for unwed young ladies who were pregnant, and the neighborhood wasn't really happy with that. Now, when the ADA came in, you said the Americans with Disabilities Act would have preempted all of that, right? At least in the case of substance abuse, they are considered disabled.
To a certain degree, yes.
Do those terms of a group home or things of that nature even appear in the land use, city's land use statute anymore at all?
We do have some terms that could, or that are like that. I think like an intermediate care facility is one. And then there's
Transition.
well, those are different, and those are outside of the city zoning code. But there are a couple of definitions that could have applied, but in looking at the nature of this particular use, it didn't fit any of those. So this is actually an area that falls outside of any of the definitions the city currently has in its zoning ordinance. And that's why there was consideration into, you know, could this property accommodate that number of people? You know, is this something that we could grant by right? Is this something that, you know, if we make a decision here that we're gonna get additional claim or requests of a similar nature, and how are we gonna handle that? And so those are all just different things that we took into consideration when internally discussing it and when discussing it with the attorney that was representing the applicant.
So just for a point of comparison, if you'll indulge me, and I'm not in any way making any equation between this type of facility and the one that I'm going to mention, but as far as I know, the ADA would not cover registered sex offenders. And there are such things as group homes for the treatment of registered sex offenders, and I know Boise has gone through that. So that would not fall under the ADA. I would hope our city statutes would require neighborhood notification. In an instance like that, if someone wanted to set up a facility of that nature. Am I correct in everything I've just said?
Well, I would assume that there's actually state laws that require that,
Okay.
because of, state registration requirements. So it wouldn't actually be the city that would regulate that, it would be the state. There would be city involvement, and, to the extent that they were running some kind of care facility unrelated to a disability, again, we'd have to, it's, the zoning is very specific to a lot of different factors, so like the number, the intensity, the use, what's the underlying zoning designation and things of that nature. But there would be requirements that probably would require notification of the neighbors, just because there's other requirements that require registration and notification
Just for one, a
anyways.
single person?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, well, it is a hypothetical scenario, but it has occurred a couple times in Boise and has caused some issues there. But under this circumstance, these individuals in this establishment fall under the ADA, so. Okay. I don't have any other questions.
I just have a comment that I feel if this were a situation where people are thinking that they should have been notified, at what point does it stop and a place can't apply for a certified family home without having to notify your neighbors that you have a house of people with intellectual disabilities, which it violates their very fundamental rights as people. So I probably shouldn't be part, I feel like it's a very cut and dry. I agree that the city had. I agree. No. You know where I'm going. Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe I agree with you. As a property owner in this town, I would be livid if this situation happened next door to me and I wasn't notified. Absolutely livid. And I have a past, I have a history, and I have walked back to where I'm at today, but I would be livid.
And I can understand people's trepidation about it, but at a very, I mean, it's a fundamental, it's not even about
I do
who
think
they
that-
are,
that- I think our city would be wise to look at solutions long-term to ensure that we do have some sort of long lens on ensuring that we're not discriminating against people with disabilities, but we are also acknowledging the fact that multi-use homes are intended to be residential and single family.
Even if there was a notification though, there's no dispute, there's no.
Have you lived in a residential facility? I don't know.
Yes, I
I have, and I don't really want to have one next door to me.
I totally get that, and I agree, right? But if you're notified as a neighbor, there's no disputing process, am I right? And so what's the point? I mean, you can't just.
If it was any other category of people, they would have a voice. And the only reason that this,
Would
they
they
don't,
though?
the only reason they don't have a voice in this is because they are a protected group. And I'm fine with that. I understand that in the black and white nature of the law. But if we were stuffing a bunch of other people in there with massive behaviors that are not protected, then that would mean, that would create a large downstream problem for the community at large. And I'm not saying
No,
that
I
this is not a protected group. And I'm not saying that these individuals who are going to be coming in and out of this home over time, I'm not saying all of them or any of them are going to have these maladaptive behaviors impregnating the community. But I can see the writing on the wall in the future in other cases. We would want to try to figure out a way to protect our larger citizen group.
I'm just thinking out loud, but it would make me curious as to what requirements the facility has in their own, within their own agency of people that they will provide services to within that, within the services that they're providing. Like, do they, if we go back to the sex offender thing, you know, are the people that are moving into the sober living having to report that they're sex offenders? I don't know that that's a requirement, you know. I think that it might be up to the facility to make that a requirement. You know, they can decide that on their own. And so if you go back, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, you know, because it's like, so then if you think about like CFH housing or something, a certified family home, is there more regulation on people being able to move into that type of housing who are sex offenders than someone who can move into a sober living house and not necessarily have to disclose that information? It just kind of makes me curious what the facility itself requires.
They are required by law to report that they are a sex offender
I think,
when they move.
I think what we really are talking about
I'm
here
just
is not
curious
really
about
whether or
that.
not these individuals have access to this online. It has, if it were 4 people, it probably wouldn't be tripping a trigger. If it were 8 people, maybe tripping a trigger, 16 people, possibly the cause. And that is a reality that we have because we don't have the words in place to actually to guide our decision-making process in the future. That is my concern looking forth. I want to protect the people that need to be protected. Actually, that's all I want to say. I want to protect the people that need to be protected.
Well, and to kind of caveat some of that is, you know, again, I said, this is a substantial property. If they had torn down that property and put in a duplex, again, they would have qualified by right to put all 16 people there. And that's where, in this instance, the nature of the property, the nature of the house, the requested accommodation, you know, it allowed for an accommodation to be granted. Again, this is a case by case analysis, looking at a lot of different factors. The only difference here is that it is one single property. But again, they could have torn that down and put in a duplex and it still would have been permitted by right and Idaho code.
Hypothetical. If 16 individual sex offenders were to move into this house, we're just using sex offender because the word's bothering me.
Only one Idaho code says you cannot house a sex offender with another sex offender.
Okay, so I'm gonna shift gears, because it wasn't really the sex offender part itself, but just like that, but just the basis, like, it could be a motorcycle, it could be a motorcycle gang that moves, they don't have to notify you at all.
You don't even have to go to extremes like that. Under city code, 16 individuals who are unrelated to themselves could hold themselves out as a family and live in a single family dwelling.
It's private property, private home. Any 16 people could move into this place. So I fail to understand, like,
What's the definition of family then? Because we're talking about a single family residence. And we have two single family residents adjacent to each other. And I'm not trying to be troublesome. But why do we have a label on it calling it a single family residence if we're not actually calling it a family residence?
I'm pulling up that section of city code. And I'll tell you what the definition is. Again, our definition of family does not have a numerical limit on it.
Fine with that.
but it also doesn't have like a foundational limit to it, right? I mean, for
It is-
instance, if, I know I'm so poor, I'm living in my dad's basement because I cannot afford rent. So I could see 16 college age kids thinking, hey,
Mhm.
let's pool our money and move into this home. And who's to stop them from doing that?
Right.
I'm not denying that it would be very unfortunate to live in that situation, but it is what it is.
Well, are there, requirements for it to be a sober living facility? Like, do they get like state or
Yes.
county funding? Are they doing a treatment plan?
That's not regulated under our zoning code, so it wasn't taken into consideration.
But I will
The
say,
facility or the owner of the property.
most sober living places, even if you're out for more than 4 or 6 hours, you have to take a drug test when you get back.
Yeah.
Like you have work release, you have sign in, sign out, like these aren't just, you're throwing 16 drug addicts into a home together. There's a structured, they have house people who have 20 some odd years of sobriety under their belts, helping to guide people. So it's not just a willy-nilly process.
But they don't have.
And typically, if they do fail a drug test, they might get so many chances, there are additional requirements for them to stay in the home, or they get booted out.
Who is paying for them to stay there?
Said funding, a lot of times Medicaid, a lot of times Medicaid said funding. Treatment funding.
A lot of people, their work release from, like, or their probationary
Yeah.
role release dictates that they have to live in a sober living unit. Can we take comments from? Is that-
That's
I'm
up to
not
you.
sure
I mean, we're beyond citizen comments, but that's up to you if you
I
want
know.
to allow somebody
Okay,
to speak.
then yes. I would procedurally, I wasn't
get
sure
her
about
name,
this.
though?
Becky Colley, I'm a realtor for 20 years. I got the IMLS here. I'm also a neighbor. That's one kitchen on IMLS. I've been in that home, that's one kitchen. Usually duplexes are considered multifamily. When you have 4 or more, it's considered commercial, but it is considered multifamily in the real estate world. In our IMLS, there's it's called RI-2plex. RE, single family, SF, RE, SFAR, single family with acreage. So to me, it is a multifamily home, but if you get this, I'm not prejudiced against disabled. I am concerned about 16 people, whether they're males, females. I did read the public report, and it mentioned that it could go co-ed. That's why they wanted the 4 bedrooms up to the 4 bedrooms down. And that these folks get lonely, that's why they needed so many people. That's in the public record report. My question is, if you allowed 16 because it was a duplex, it's not considered a duplex in our IMLS. It also doesn't have 2 kitchens, it doesn't have 2 addresses, it doesn't have 2 meters, which you have to have if it's a duplex. So that you can record the meters for heating or whatever. But if the reason it became 16, which is my concern, 16 versus 8, that's 2 families, it's a duplex, it is not a duplex. Wasn't advertised a duplex, isn't a duplex by any consideration. it is a single family home, which your ordinance, city ordinance says 8, with no discrimination. So my question is, who told you 2 kitchens? Who told you duplex so that you could go for 16?
So the definition of family under Lewiston City Code means one or more persons occupying a single dwelling unit and living as a single household unit. A dwelling unit is one or more rooms designated for occupancy by one family. A dwelling two family, it does mean a detached building on a single lot containing 2 dwelling units. And a multifamily dwelling means a building unit containing 3 or more dwelling units. So that's why under Lewiston City Code, which IMLS is not a city regulation, it's not Idaho code, it has no effect on the decision making of the city. That is a regulatory body for real estate agents. But
One kitchen.
the city, again, this is a reasonable accommodation request. We understand this is not a duplex, but in finding a reasonable accommodation to the request that was made, because they wanted to hold themselves out as a single family unit. And the only reason why they were not able to was because under Lewiston City Code, a single family dwelling is limited to one grouping of 8 individuals with disabilities. I'll pull up that definition up. It's a pretty long definition because it includes this limitation. So on its face, a single family dwelling means a detached building containing 1 dwelling unit or 1 dwelling unit with an accessory apartment, and shall include Class A manufactured home as defined herein, a tiny house as defined in and built to the standards of the International Residential Code, and any group residence in which 8 or fewer unrelated mentally and or physically handicapped or elderly persons reside and who are supervised at the group residence in connection with their handicap or age-related infirmity pursuant to Idaho Code 67-6531. So they could qualify as a family under Lewiston City Code because they proffered that they are 16 individuals who are holding themselves out as a single family, single household unit. But under the definition of single family dwelling, they are limited only on the basis of their disability from living in a single family dwelling. So that is where the nature of the reasonable accommodation request came in. And again, we are required to review the request and to grant a reasonable accommodation. And after the interactive process, a reasonable accommodation was found to classify each grouping of 8 individuals as a single family dwelling because of a variety of factors, including that the property supported it. And what's listed on the IMLS is not necessarily what is reality, because my understanding too, at one point, it was only listed as having 5 bedrooms, but it does have 8 bedrooms. So again, there are renovations to the property. But that's, again, the property supports the number of people, and that is the main consideration here. And under that definition, if they were not disabled, all 16 could have lived there. And but for them being disabled persons, that was the only thing holding them back in city code. And working with this group, as we are required to under the ADA and the FHA, we found a reasonable accommodation that did not fundamentally alter the land use codes and the permitted uses in an R2A zone, which allows for up to a 2-family residence. There's other uses in here, in the R2A that could have created just as much an intensity problem as having 16 people. There's other uses by right this property could be used for. And in the instance that an individual is using the property in a by right status, there is no notification given to the neighbors. And just as much as these individuals are entitled to buy and use property as anybody else, their disability status alone is not the basis in which the city can notify neighbors about them moving in. We wouldn't do that for any other protected class of individuals, whether it's disability, the color of their skin, their religious orientation, nationality, or anything else. The city looks at, these are all protected classes, and we don't notify people, our neighbors, when individuals in protected classes are moving into particular neighborhoods.
Madam Chairman, I have a question. My concern is not location. I understand that. My concern is not disability and being prejudiced against that. I'm not. My concern is, I heard her say they have 2 kitchens, but she said at the beginning of her talk, is why we're allowing it as 2 families, 8 times 2 is 16.
Well, it wasn't because of the kitchen that they're allowing it.
That was what the reasonable accommodation was for.
The reasonable
Correct.
accommodation was that under the city code, it only allowed 8 if you were disabled.
Right.
If you weren't disabled, you could have a family of 20 in there.
Does reasonable accommodation mean disability request? I thought it meant anybody, college kids.
No, a person with a disability can make a reasonable accommodation request to the city to request an accommodation because of their disability to a policy, regulation, service, program, a facility. They can make a request, and we are, under the ADA, federal law, required to do an interactive process with that person to determine if the city can provide a reasonable accommodation, and when it can, it should.
And Lewiston's is 8, so my question is why 16?
Again, it's the state of Idaho that sets this particular number. And the reason why we did 16 is because, again, if you look at single family dwelling, the intent under the state legislature's determination is that 8 people with a disability qualify for a single family residence. Here you have 16, which is 8 and 8. And so if you apply that to the definition, then you could have essentially 2 single family dwellings within the unit. The limitation is based solely on the number and not the dwelling itself. So when we're looking at whether or not this particular dwelling could accommodate that number of people, we looked at a variety of different factors, building permits and other things of that nature. We looked at the property, the county assessors, the size assessment. We looked at the number of rooms. We looked at, what other features were on this property, the size of the property, what's the square footage. Those are all things that we took into consideration to say, is it reasonable for a land intensity purpose that 16 people could be residing at this particular property? And we came to the conclusion after discussions that it is reasonable that a 16 family member, a 16 unit family could probably live there. And the only reason why these people had to apply for this reasonable accommodation was solely on the basis of their disability. If they were not disabled, they would not have been required to apply for anything with the city, and they could have just moved in.
Except they're not a family.
But they can hold themselves out as a family unit. There's nothing that requires a blood relation or any kind of marital relation. It has to be 1 or more persons holding themselves out as a family unit. And that was what was included in their original accommodation request, is that they are willing to hold themselves out as a single household unit and treat each other as a family.
Madam Chairman, another question that brings up is, the fire marshal mentioned that many people in one home requires sprinkler systems like a hotel. Have they been notified about that?
Again, our determination was not based off of fire codes or anything like that. It was solely based on the zoning ordinance and the land and the intensity of the use.
I think her suggestion there is that you would then go to the people who purchased the house and are turning it into a super living home. That would be on their prerogative to get those
Is that-
things.
You know,
It's-
Moonlight Mountain Recovery.
Yes.
This might be a really silly question that I should know the answer to, but if 16 people could just move into this house, then why is the reasonable accommodation even being having to be made? Why couldn't these people just go do it and not?
Because city code defines a single family residence as 8
Oh, okay.
disabled people or.
which effectively doubled. I know that there are some real careful lines we gotta walk to be appropriate here, but it effectively doubled the opportunity for income potential for whoever owns and operates this facility. And I feel like there's a really good chance that maybe somebody is using the ADA to kind of bludgeon the community into having an opportunity to double their income capacity. And I feel like the we ought to, as a city, we ought to make sure that we are protecting the vulnerable and making sure that in the future, this question doesn't happen. So that we don't have a bunch of ticked off citizens, taxpaying citizens on either end of the situation. I recognize that there's no appeal in this situation. I also recognize why there's some pissed off people. I'd like to try to find a way that we can make sure that we are protecting people with disabilities in the future, while also acknowledging the fact that maybe we could do different and we can find ways to write code and that's going to acknowledge the fact these things are real.
I feel like the underlying issue here might ultimately stem from the fact that people with alcohol and drug addictions are classified as disabled. I think that's what people have problems with. Where it is genuinely, I'll open up, I'm an alcoholic, and I'll tell you what, like, it is a genuine thing.
I don't think that that's the problem. I think the problem is there's 16 and not 8.
The number.
I really think that's the problem.
Exactly.
And I think that if we had done 8, we wouldn't be sitting here conversing about whether or not we're protecting people with disabilities, because those people would already be being protected and we wouldn't have to worry about that.
I'm about to bring my own opinion into this, so I'm going to sit out how I'm feeling at this moment. Actually, no, I am going to, because I do feel as though I myself have never lived in a sober home. I think we got my feet under me before I hit rock bottom, but I do understand that in a lot of sober living situations, you're required to have a roommate.
Yes.
So you have 8 bedrooms, boom, 16 people.
Yep.
Why would you not max your potential? That's business 101, right? I mean, that from a capitalistic standpoint, this makes perfect sense. You have 8 bedrooms, need a
Yeah, all of
roommate,
the other
16 people.
transitional or sober living houses, the most in there are roommates. I think there's one house that has one single bed in it. And I think that's a family unit for somebody that has children in the Oxford house.
I didn't know.
So they all have roommates.
So I feel like the issue at play here is that I don't think it's 8 people. I don't think it's 16. I think it's that drug and alcohol addicted people are living in your neighborhood.
I certainly think that,
I
I
think it should
believe
be
that you
both.
believe that. I agree with you. I think it can be both.
Yes,
I think it can be.
We've changed the name of the home, to a facility. Is
okay.
that because they mount people?
No, it's
What,
not.
what did that?
it's
Is
not
that
a
people
fac-
turned down
that's-
there?
I think I might have
arbitrary.
loosely done that on my.
Yeah.
I think
No,
that's-
my
But
experience.
it is a
was-
facility.
My
It's not a
experience
home. It's a
is facility based, and I
It's a
probably loosely
business
did that.
office.
It's referred to as the recovery house.
Yes.
So
Whatever.
facility is just an arbitrary word that people are throwing
I
around.
should call it anything.
I mean, again,
Yeah,
if,
you can't, it's a recovery house.
if a private LLC or corporation bought that house and wanted to put 16 bunk bed, or, 8 bunk beds in there and rent out a per bed space, it would still be a single family residence.
It's owned by a nonprofit,
But
Is it a
again,
nonprofit? Well, then that should make you feel better that their money is not going into the pockets of anybody, but going back into their programs to increase the likelihood of these people coming out of the house
Being successful.
being successful. And that's what the point of a recovery home is
prejudice against.
I shouldn't have used the term, I don't think I used the term prejudice.
but again, if someone bought this house and put 8 bunk beds in there and wanted to rent out weekly, monthly, those bunk beds to 16 individuals, there's nothing in our city code that would have stopped it in our zoning ordinance.
I-
Not looking at other regulations or
I-
anything like that, because there are laws in Idaho that prohibit cities from regulating short-term rentals. But that is still a residential use.
I totally agree with you, and that's why I think that the real issue is that we need to ensure that we are looking in the future to identify code changes that can protect us from having this situation occur in the future.
This is federally regulated, so we are limited in what regulations we can do, and we're also limited by state code, certain changes. That's why this is solely a reasonable accommodation request. It was, in the instance that we can find a reasonable accommodation like we have here to classify this as a 2-family dwelling that allows essentially 2 family units under the zoning and state codes of 8 individuals for up to 16, and because the property accommodated it, that is the reasonable accommodation. That does not mean that if we get another request to allow 24 individuals in a property that would accommodate maybe only 10, that we are going to approve it. Also, you know, in that instance, it would be a multifamily dwelling. And we would have to, you know, look at whether or not that is permitted by right or a conditional use. What we tried to do is find a sustainable accommodation that if we got something similar, we could assess it under a similar process. And not have discrepancies in how we're assessing these, because even the difference in how, you know, if we get a similar request that is otherwise identical, but for the number of people and the property itself, we have to use the same reasoning for approval or not approving that request. And we're trying to create a sustainable model.
Yeah, so the reason that I wanted to bring this discussion to this group, you know, it's great getting the view of the law, how this works, how the process works. The law is set, so to speak, that part we can't change. It would probably be a very bad idea to start tweaking at that. And I'll leave it there. What this group could provide, I think, is knowing that this is gonna happen again. In some similar way. Most likely, this will occur in another part of Lewiston. How is there anything out of the box, so to speak, out of the box thinking approaches that the community or this group could take to not make it as confrontational or difficult for either side? And that's one of the things
I think the onus on that is going to be the organization themselves. They would have to be the ones to reach out. There's nothing the city can do.
I agree with that.
There, honestly, it's,
But that should also be an expectation that is met. And I don't know that, I don't know this, I am just aware of this today, unfortunately.
oh yeah, I wish I would have been prepared for this one, because I'm learning new things.
But the reality is, and there's so many other factors that are at play here. We're talking about property owners that purchased in this town in good faith of some sort, that their long-term interests are going to be continually met. I also recognize that we're talking about disability, so I get that. But
The disability still needs to be protected, even if the disability is not
Oh, sure.
precisely one that everybody is willing to.
I keep
Yes.
coming back to 16 versus 8, and I keep coming back to having lived in and.
That's
worked
where the
in-
reasonable accommodation is coming in, is that the city found no reason to deny a reasonable
I have
accommodation.
worked in facilities and good places like this, and I hesitate to say that anyone just,
I would love to see a picture of the
I
house.
would like to know whether or not this house can accommodate 16. And I would like to know who decides whether or not it can accommodate 16.
Oh, wow.
And
Mine
if-
keeps getting.
I mean,
It looks just
Yeah.
like a
Madam Chair,
Watch the video.
you have to exchange that with everyone, otherwise you're gonna have a problem.
thank you, Jen. Are you sure you don't wanna come back? Heather.
That's not, that's not.
Oh,
That's true.
Totally enough. The good not on both from 16. People on drugs is, kind of. I understand that they are a protected class. I think children should be, the most important protected class. And are there any, there's a, reason why, you know, we don't allow drugs and smoking in your school zones or any places where children are there, other avenues that, can be taken if,
Well, there would be no drug or alcohol use on the premises.
That's the whole point.
Yeah, and if they were caught partaking in it, they would be evicted.
Well, that would be up to the facility to decide,
Yeah.
most likely.
But it would not be introducing drugs and alcohol to the,
one,
To the extent that the
they have
city,
actions that negatively affect.
to the extent that the city, again, this is a zoning question, the city would not regulate an individual, an individual's use of drug or alcohol, even if they live right next door to a school themselves, other than the criminal laws that they got caught, but for our zoning purposes, we would not regulate that aspect. We would not regulate that in this instance as well.
I do wanna note that it is 1 o'clock. I don't know, I'm able to stay longer.
I've got an appointment.
Okay. Would this conversation be good for next month? If people still feel strongly about it? I legitimately believe if the city has done what the city can do.
If anything, I would recommend maybe considering some kind of advocacy or like public awareness campaign about sober living
Well, and
facilities.
can we have the mountain recovery,
It's Blue Mountain, or Moonlight Mountain.
Moonlight Mountain?
I just found on the road yesterday.
Could we have a representative from Moonlight come and talk to us about their facility?
We could not
You think-
require it.
No, not required, invite.
Invite.
Just to,
I think.
to kind of, not even plead it, because again, they didn't. They don't have to explain anything to anybody.
Yeah, I think it would
but
be
it
good
would
for us
be-
to brainstorm as a group, some ideas that could help.
Or
make this
Even if we
more-
could have just somebody from a
Well, then I think,
sober living facility come in.
Well, the recovery, or the recovery center, and then they have geo reentry down excavation, either one or both, I think would probably be happy to provide some kind of presentation of nature.
I
Would
honestly,
that make the
Would that make
community
anybody feel
feel?
better?
If the city doesn't regulate it,
Already identity.
who regulates?
It's private property. It would be the person on the property's prerogative to
So,
regulate.
so if she's not, or he's not doing their job, making sure this, that's,
We'll call headquarters.
how would I know? How would anybody?
Well, if you
It's not
don't know, then they're
actually-
doing their job.
If it starts to infringe.
Just wondering
feed
if
your
solar
life.
homes need any regulation, like are there certain?
Yes.
rules?
Oh, yes, there is.
Yes,
Who
I,
regulates?
The state, because a lot of the funding comes from the state and federal.
okay, well, that said, we can look at inviting people to next month's meeting to further discuss, perhaps. Active agenda, meeting minutes, Mark. Did you see any
Misspelling.
Oh, the minutes?
any corrections?
Well, nothing major. Jolene's last name was misspelled on the booze.
you're gonna love Mark.
I'm a punctuation person.
He hasn't gone
I
that
can't wait
far.
for the day that I find a mistake in what he writes.
Oh. It was that,
That's all.
that was all? All right,
I mean, I wasn't at the meeting, so I can't verify what happened.
I saw no.
I thought it was fine too.
Does anybody move?
I will motion to approve the minutes.
All right. Any seconds?
Second.
All approved?
I,
Any further discussion before we say nay? Continue on. Future agenda items, I think we just discussed perhaps finding.
And I can help with that.
Perfect. Any other future agenda items? Yeah. People would care
Are we
to,
gonna do anything about the street at the end that doesn't have a turnaround? Future items.
that would be like a public works or,
It's unrelated.
yeah,
But
that would be a different, department.
Must have 16 people driving cars like that. There's no place to turn around now. Except my driveways. But I understand.
There's a public works committee available if you wanna go to them.
Yeah.
I've been talking to the mayor for 15 years, if not longer. It's
Thanks.
Commissioner comments, I just want to do a really quick one. It's DSP Appreciation Week.
Yay.
For anybody that doesn't know, it's a direct support professional. That is somebody who is paid and trained to work with individuals with disabilities. It's a really tough job, grossly underpaid. A lot of places can only afford to pay what the city or what the state reimburses. They do really hard work so that people can continue to be parts of their community. Anyway, so just wanted to throw that out there. DSPs, any staff liaison or any other staff liaison? Nikki?
Oh,
Leah?
keep my mouth shut.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, then I think we're done. Adjourned 106.
Thank you.
Mike, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Should we, everybody, how many years of service